The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. Major changes have been made to Singapore's electoral map, with just 5 GRCs and 4 single-seat wards remaining unchanged from the last election. 5 new GRCs and 6 new SMCs have been created, according to the report released by the Electoral Boundaries Review Committee earlier today. The total number of constituencies now stands at 33, compared to 31 previously. The next parliament will comprise 97 elected members of parliament, up from the current 93, with each MP representing about 28,400 voters, slightly fewer than in the last election. The EBRC explained in its report that the changes took into consideration the significant growth in the voter numbers in certain areas, along with consequential changes to adjacent wards. Now, some boundary lines have also been realigned along geographical features such as major roads. So what impact will these changes have on GE 2025? How will the electoral landscape change? Well, to find out more, joining us now is Eugene Tan, who's Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. Professor, thank you so much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me, Hongbin. It's always a pleasure.
It's always a pleasure having you on, Professor. Professor, just to kickstart our interview here, what do you make of these changes so far?
Hongbin, electoral boundaries will have to be adjusted simply because, we are still having new housing estates being developed. So there are these population changes, and depending on whether you want to, for example, reduce the number of voters that an MP serves, or whether you want to reduce the average size of the GRC, all these will have an impact with regard to the electoral boundaries. And so when I look at the changes, I think in a way they are to be expected. We can go into the details as to some of those changes, and then we could perhaps even consider, people may consider, why not this change and why not another set of changes. But I think it's important, to recognize, that these changes are, at least to my mind, they are neutral, in the sense that they are not going to affect the competitiveness of parties on the ground.
I see. So what are the main factors that led to the changes in Singapore's electoral map, particularly the creation of new GRCs and SMCs?
Well, I think when you distill, the driving considerations, behind the EBRC's recommendations, they really have to do, with the terms of reference that the Prime Minister gave to the Electoral Boundaries Committee, right? So among them, right, would be the need for the EBRC to take into account significant changes in the number of voters, that is, in the different constituencies as a result of population shifts. And we should note, as well as housing developments. And I'll elaborate on this in a bit. But it's also about, mentioned earlier, keeping the average ratio of voters to elected MPs, the average size of the GRCs, the proportion of MPs that are elected from SMCs. The direction given by the Prime Minister, was to keep it at about the same, for the 2025 GE as it was, for the 2020 general election.
Right. Well, given that these electoral boundaries are, redrawn periodically, what do you think will be the public perception of these changes?
Perceptions, I think, will vary. There is certainly that stereotype, that these changes serve to benefit the ruling party. But I think when you consider, the fact that the ruling party is least affected, that is simply because, the ruling party, the PAP, is represented, across the entire island, right? Whether they are the incumbents or not, they're a party branch, in every of the 93 seats in Parliament. So what this means is that, even though there are changes, the PAP will continue to contest in every available seat. But if you contrast that, with the opposition, right, because they don't contest in every seat individually, right? And for certain smaller opposition parties, they may contest in a handful of seats. And so this is where, the electoral boundary changes, when they happen, could result in some of them, feeling displaced electorally, if I could put it that way. So a good example would be Dr. Chee Soon Juan of the Singapore Democratic Party. So he has contested in Bukit Batu SMC in the last 2 general elections. Bukit Batu SMC will not exist in the coming general election. And so, I think his natural reaction would be that, the changes have been unfair. But I think if you consider, that if the EBRC were to take into account party-specific arrangements on the ground, party-specific interests and needs, then I think, the whole process of reviewing the boundaries, would become heavily politicized. So in fact, what you have is the political parties dictating, as to whether boundaries should change or not. But I think, the other point is, I think when Singaporeans look at the EBRC report, I think they will be able to see that in this particular edition, the EBRC does endeavor to go into some level of detail why certain changes are made, and we go back again, that many of these changes, relate to the terms of reference, but, the EBRC, will have to decide, how to redraw it, such that those terms of reference will be met.
I see. Well, Professor, then do you believe that these changes will enhance or diminish public trust in the electoral process and our government's fairness?
I think it's important, to recognize that, that the EBRC, it comprises of senior civil servants, and they act independently of the government. Yes, they are appointed, by the Prime Minister, but even if you have an independent electoral commission, somebody will have to appoint, members of that commission. And I think unless, that we have evidence, that the EBRC seeks to recommend changes, to the benefit of one party and to the disadvantage of other parties, I think it's important, to not malign, the work that the EBRC does. And I think when you look at this edition of the EBRC report, I think they have taken on, the public feedback, that the EBRC should provide more details as to the changes. And I think they have endeavored, to do that. I think they certainly don't want to go into the possibility that, they have to explain every change in copious detail, right? But I think when you look at the report, I think one can say that, the committee has sought to be consistent with the terms of reference. They have used empirical data, that there is a sound and reasonable logic, to how they went about making those recommendations. So I think, on the whole, right, I think for some people, they might say that, it's not good enough, but I don't see the EBRC, EBRC report affecting, public trust, in the electoral process. I think they will, when they read the report, see that, there was that very conscious effort, to explain why certain recommendations, particularly the more significant changes, why they had to be done.
I see. Well, let's dive into some of the changes here. Professor, the EBRC has proposed the creation of 2 new 4-member GRCs, including the new Punggol GRC. How do you think these changes will affect the political landscape, particularly in the northeast region of Singapore?
Well, we go back again, right? These changes are not meant to make a particular contest in a particular electoral division more or less competitive, right? Those are really what happens, during the election campaign, the sort of manifestos that the parties put forward to the candidates on the ground. But I think, with particular reference to, the northeast part of the island, so there are still these population changes, which has resulted in the creation of, 2 new GRCs. And the northeast part of the island is also, I think, one where, the Workers' Party has been walking the ground, right? Maybe not throughout the entire northeast part of the island, but I think with previously, you used to only have Pasir Ris Punggol GRC, but now you have 2 new GRCs. I think, we probably can expect the northeastern part of the island, to attract a lot of interest from opposition parties, who might take the view that, a new SMC or a new GRC presents a more level playing field for them. But I would say that, these changes, on the whole, generally, will not affect the political landscape significantly.
Right. Well, following the creation of Punggol GRC, the remaining polling districts from the former Pasir Ris Punggol GRC will be combined with the Loyang and Flora estates. Do you think this move adequately reflects the growing needs of the electorate, and how might this change impact voter engagement, Professor?
Well, I think it's really, the point about voter engagement, is that, rather than having large GRCs, right, because the law provides for up to even 6-member GRCs, and I think when you look at latest EBRC report, the average size is now 4.56 MPs for GRCs, down from 4.65. It is a marginal decrease, but I think the thinking is that smaller GRCs, but not too small, will enable, the MPs, to better engage the voters, not just in the particular districts that they are responsible for, right, but also throughout the entire GRC. And I think, one could think of, let's say, the current Punggol GRC, where you have 5 MPs, looking after a very large number of voters. But in 2025 GE, we will have 2 smaller 4-member GRCs. And so I think, if you sort of do the math, you're looking at 8 MPs, compared to 5. Yeah, I think, that could better attend to the needs of the electorate in the new housing estates, and it will also strengthen, voter engagement.
I see. Well, speaking of GRCs, becoming too large here, new SMCs have been carved out from constituencies like Ang Mo Kio, Sembawang, and Tampines to prevent GRCs from becoming too large. What are the potential pros and cons, though, of having more SMCs in the political system?
Well, I think we need that mix of GRCs and SMCs, right? So the GRC's purpose was really to ensure that we have adequate minority representation in Singapore's parliament. And that's an important part of the way we practice multiracialism. I think certainly, the opposition parties would prefer, to have more SMCs, right? Because I think they regard that as that providing for a more competitive contest, right? Because it's one candidate from one party against another, whereas in a GRC, the argument is that the GRC team is only as strong as the weakest member of the team. So I would say that, this mix of GRCs and SMCs, in our electoral system, in many ways, addresses the needs of multiracialism, in particular multiracial representation. It also, provides the opportunity for smaller opposition parties, to be able to contest in the general election. But I suppose, the dispute will still be whether the balance could be different, right? So for example, maybe 50% of the seats should be reserved for SMCs, and the other 50 for GRCs. I think at the moment, with the recommendation in 2025 GE, SMCs will comprise slightly above, 15% of all elected seats. So certainly there'll be the argument whether there could be a higher proportion.
I see. Well, the report also highlights that electoral boundaries for opposition-held wards such as Sengkang GRC and Hougang will remain unchanged. Professor, what is your take on this decision then, and how might it influence the political competitiveness of the opposition in these areas?
I don't think it affects the political competitiveness at all. I think the EBRC report, noted that, the population numbers have remained stable, and there is no need to make the adjustments, to the opposition held wards of Sengkang GRC and Hougang. So I would say that, the idea, that the EBRC would make recommendations, to benefit the ruling party, I think it's not made out, and I think one could think of Sengkang GRC, which was a newly created GRC in GE2020, and we know the famous victory that the Workers' Party had in Sengkang GRC, so there is nothing to be said about, new GRCs will benefit only the ruling party. I think GRC system cuts both ways. The PAP can win big, as the critics would argue, but they can also lose big. For example, if they lose GRC, and very often that would include at least 2 or even 3 political office holders who are contesting in the PAP team in that GRC.
Right. Professor, the next parliament will also comprise 97 elected members of parliament, up from the current 93, with each MP representing about 28,400 voters. Now, the number of MPs per GRC has been steadily decreasing over the years. What are the potential implications of this trend for political representation, and what challenges do you think the EBRC also faces in balancing the need for geographical representation and managing uneven voter growth across different wards?
So you rightly pointed out in your second question, the task that the EBRC has. You need to have that representation, that is in alignment with how people look at what does it mean to be in Jurong or Changi or Marine Parade, as well as, having to deal with the fact that, you will have uneven voter growth across, the different constituencies. But I think when you look at the slight decline, in the number of voters that each MP will represent, I think, there is clearly the recognition that the load on an MP is significant. Our system here doesn't endorse, the idea of full-time MPs for all MPs, right? We do have some full-time MPs, but I think the system takes the view that we have all our MPs being full-time, then that may not be good for the system. So I would say that it reflects the demands on the MP. It also recognizes that it is important, for Singaporeans to be adequately represented, and we shouldn't, overburden MPs with unmanageable number of voters, right? So as the population increases, we see the number of MPs increasing as well, right? So in 2020, we had 93 elected seats, and as we know, in the coming general election, there will be 97, right? And one of the thoughts that crossed my mind was whether there is enough room in the current chamber in Parliament, to put in another 4 extra seats.
I see. Well, Professor, in the past 4 general elections, the time between the release of the EBRC report and polling day has ranged from 2 to 4 months. So, of course, the million-dollar question before we let you go here, Professor, when can we expect elections to be held now, and what else would you be looking out for as we edge closer to GE 2025?
Well, certainly with the publication of the EBRC report, that brings another milestone has been cleared, right? And so really the next milestone is the dissolution of Parliament, as well as the issuance of the writ of election, right? And for both of these, the Prime Minister will advise the President on the timing. But I would say that, with this publication of the EBRC report today, 4 days after the Prime Minister, received the report from the EBRC, that it opens the first window for the general election, to be sometime in early May. So I do anticipate that Parliament will sit one more time in April, and then subsequently, a few days later, or even just at the end of that Parliament sitting, Parliament, could be dissolved. And so when that happens, right, you would have a case in which it would be about 3.5 to 4 weeks between the release of the EBRC report and the dissolution of Parliament, right? So it is in tandem with what you mentioned earlier, that the release of the EBRC report and the polling day, the time interval has ranged from 2 to 4 months, because polling day will typically take place about 3 weeks after Parliament is dissolved. Right. So I think, the first window is opening, and that points to an early May general election.
It looks like it's just a matter of time till the election is called. Well, thank you so much, Professor, for your time and your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was Eugene Tan, Associate Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.